What on earth is
What
happening there, Tom?
what is going on?
What is going on? What,
Well,
in fact, I mean, when we look at this beautiful kind of dance of
mm,
connections being built and made and the information passing down some highways, an idea what it is an image of?
I reckon we're zoomed in, aren't we?
Yes.
So it's also doing a time lapse thing. So it's
Yes.
obviously a loop. So something's happening that might happen over a period of time. Something to do with our synapses.
Indeed, Tom. Indeed, it is.
Mm,
So what we're physically seeing here, I guess, is the synaptic connections being built. So we're almost seeing learning. So if we take that idea of learning being the transfer of information through short-term memory into schema, so
mm,
interconnected and interconnections in our long-term memory that allow us to then access those really easily to be able to tackle unknown challenges and things like that. It's literally about making connections. And that's
yep.
why I love solar taxonomy in terms of relational to me is always thinking about, we're actually building these. But the challenge, I guess, Tom, is that in order to be able to see learning happening at this level, we'd have to be scanning brains all of the time. I'm sure we could invent some kind of helmet to do that for our kids.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
we can't really see learning at all, right? So what do we need to think about if we can't physically see learning happening? I'm really interested in what we're going to explore now in other ways of being able to see learning.
Yeah, because I think one of the great questions we often grapple with when we're working with teams of teachers and with schools is how do we know that learning is taking place? And I suppose what you have here is if you actually look, I'm sorry, I'm still transfixed by this little image. It's fascinating. Top left-hand corner, that little kind of blob is dancing around. He's making a connection and then he's not so sure. I think it's just interesting to kind of think how, and as you said, when we talk about the solar taxonomy, we have a specific phase that talks about connections. And I think that the interesting thing is it's mirroring exactly what is happening at a synaptic level. And so that's helpful for us to understand some of the neurochemical change that's going on. But it is so difficult. So how do we know that learning is taking place? And so one of the things that we have to be able to grapple with is that everything that happens in our classrooms, everything that we create is a representation, is a substitute for learning taking place. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to represent learning in a way that we can clearly see these connections, the depth of understanding, the conceptual knowledge that students have. And so we're trying to recreate in many ways the connections and the learning that's taking place. And obviously that's very difficult to do. So everything that we work with our students and everything that is created is in some form a version of that. And so a key question for us is about this idea of a proxy for learning. It's a substitute. It's a representation of learning. It isn't actually learning itself. It's always going to be something that represents that. And so during this particular chapter, we're going to be grappling with that concept. And so this idea of a substitute, this idea of a particular representation is a crucial one. And we've got a range of different proxies that I'm sure that we all know. And some, Chris, though, are better than others, aren't they?
Definitely, and I think we have some really what we'd often look at as standard proxies for learning. So we might do a quiz or an exam or standardized criteria. There are some positive things in that there's a sense of being able to capture what students don't know through, and actually really quite useful for your own teaching practice. So to understand what have kids misunderstood or what don't they know, so that I can actually adapt my teaching. It's not super useful for students often, in terms of actually moving forward, because it tends to be a kind of slightly terminal and summative piece. Things like written reflections, mind maps, and video responses are a little bit more open and maybe give us more opportunities for students to show what they do know rather than what they don't know in terms of being a proxy for their learning. And finally, that piece around, having really strong learning conversations, getting kids to keep a learning log and learner-led portfolios. I can do this thing because I have. So kids actually evidencing their own learning.
Yeah.
all of these are useful in their own right. But I do think, and I'm really passionate about the idea that, as you are, Tom, because we talk about dialogic learning, this idea of learning conversation. It's all about, we can learn so much about a student's understanding through a simple conversation. And I think that's a really powerful proxy for us to think about. So although I'm not judging any of them and saying any are worse or better than the rest, I am saying that this one, no, that this idea that some of them give us more depth and possibly louder signals as well, I think, Tom.
Yeah, I think it's also useful just to kind of get a handle on how much time it takes to set these up. And there's something about the immediacy of dialogue or the immediacy of talk and how quickly we can generate that proxy. And so the way that a student says something or the vocabulary that they choose, their immediate response to a particular question is a proxy for us, is a proxy for what they have learned about that particular concept. And if we've been careful about how we design that question, that proxy is a clear signal to us about what's going on. And so I think it's interesting to reflect on this slide on there's many different many different proxies. We create many of them every day when we're working with our students, when we're designing learning. And so it's useful to think about those that take very little time and can be generated quickly versus those that might take a little bit longer, and what they then represent, how accurate they are in terms of a clear, accurate representation about the learning a student has developed or has shown. And so that's just an interesting thing to think of, is like, what can we quickly generate within our own setting?
And it's also interesting to consider that there are some proxies which aren't designed. So that one of the challenges that we know, there's obviously been a lot of remote learning happening around the world in recent times, and suddenly we lose the ability to have kind of body language signals, which aren't designed proxies, but you can learn so much just from the feeling in the class as well, and just the body language of an individual about how they're feeling about their learning. It's actually a really interesting non-designed proxy as well. But yeah, these are a couple of examples up on the screen here, but there are thousands, and you're creative enough to find the ones which are really powerful. So what do we kind of, I guess, measure? What are we looking for when we're designing really good proxies, Tom?
Well, I suppose it's one of the things that we can think of is, and this is another key concept for you all to explore, is this idea of a signal of learning. And so one of the things that we are grappling with during this particular course is paying particular attention to signals of learning growth. So there are many different signals of learning taking place, and many different things that we could pay attention to in the classroom. I was fortunate enough to work with some teachers just recently, and we were doing some moderation around the solar taxonomy, looking at evidence and looking at the signals, and they had done some filming, and I just clicked on a video, watched 2 seconds of a thinking routine a student was doing, but I could hear all sorts of things happening within the classroom. It was just there was a great mass and a great swell of different signals. And I think that we have to recognize there's all sorts of different things that we could pay attention to in terms of what's happening for a learner. Our job is to design moments that give us a clear and strong signal about that particular learner, about that particular learner's growth in terms of how their understanding is changing. And so when we design better proxies, when we design something that represents something in a really accurate way, it gives us a much clearer signal. And so these are a couple of other things that will help us along the way. So these are the sorts of things that we kind of need. We need to have a clear sense of what's the concept or what's the outcome that we're intending. Having that kind of established well and explicitly shared is always going to sort of support our attempt to try to be really clear in the signal that we generate. And we've also referenced the knowledge set, mindset, skill set, tool set there, because the signal could come from each of the, in terms of could come from each of those. It could be about the way we observe a student using a particular tool or technique. It could be the skill that we notice be sort of developing. It may even be the language that they are using that shows their disposition towards something. It may actually not be anything spoken or deliberately shared. It may just be the way they hold themselves in their collaboration, the way their non-verbal cues, as Chris was mentioning. There's signals there that we could pay attention to. One of the things that we often find, though, is that there are many things that show us or reveal to us learning taking place that we didn't actually intend. And I think that this is also a fascinating area of development for all of us, is how do we pay attention to these things in a robust way? And so remember that the Solo taxonomy gives us that robustness. It's a clear framework. When these signals are being generated, we're maybe paying attention to the strongest. We've designed those carefully. Once we have that signal, we are then able to make more sense of it. And it's also giving us the opportunity to make meaning out of those unintended outcomes that we sort of reveal within the classroom, within the learning experience. Chris, this is an interesting area, the unintended nature of learning outcomes, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that the more open the kind of proxy or the assessment task, if you want to give it a kind of a narrow frame, the more open that is to students in the sense that they can broadly explore what they can show you what they can do and what they are able to do, versus you've got 10 questions and you're either going to get them right or wrong. We're not going to see unintended learning outcomes in that quite narrow standardized focus. And we'll definitely see more unintended learning outcomes with an open focus. And often we'll think about, what's the content, what's the process, and what's the product of learning. And the more, if you think of the product as one of the proxies for learning, and the more choice, the more agency we give learners over the products that they create to demonstrate their learning, or the proxies they create to demonstrate learning, the more unintended learning we see. And it's the balance between, well, this is what I intended, and brilliant, I'm going to celebrate that, that's been shown. But look at this. This is really interesting. I've seen something here which I wasn't expecting to see, or certainly didn't intentionally design. But there's also a little caveat there, Tom, as well, is that along with those unintended learning outcomes, the more open we make our proxies, we sometimes end up with a little bit of noise as well. And what we mean by noise is this kind of, okay, this isn't really telling me anything. I need to kind of move this out of the way. I need to try and focus in and find the strongest signal that I can, which is demonstrating both intended learning outcomes and potentially also unintended learning outcomes.
I suppose the key thing here is that the reason why we're trying to pay attention to those signals is to help the learner move on, to help them know where to go next, to kind of meet them at that point, to understand that moment where they stand in their journey, to get a clear sense of it, to make meaning about that. When we're faced with many different signals, the kind of signal noise sort of scenario, where it's much more difficult to kind of very, very accurately classify and make meaning about where the learner is on their journey. And so it's much harder for us to be able to then say, this is what you need to do next. I know exactly what needs to happen in terms of the challenge for you going forwards. And so when we use a Solo taxonomy, we have that framework. Now we have to be able to design what actually comes to us, the signal that comes to us, so that we can use the framework to make sense of those signals.
So why don't we then spend a little bit of time, Tom, and do a little bit of a stop and build activity. And what we'd love you to do is just to use one of the spare pages in your workbook, or whatever you want to do, post notes, whatever works for you, and just maybe capture some of those proxies that you use, that you use often in your class, and really thinking about what do I always get kids to do? Like, do I always get them to do a presentation? Do I always get them to do an essay? Do I always get them to do a test? And maybe also consider what other proxies in a creative manner could you explore with your students to really help them to demonstrate the depth of their understanding against the intended learning outcome, using Solo obviously as the language, but also maybe which would generate some interesting unintended learning outcomes. So really let yourself just stop, think about those proxies, think about those things that you ask students to do, that you design for students to do, and maybe also consider which ones are giving you really strong signals.